I'm not joking, I can't stop. Forgive me for only today. In the village called Karim lived a boy named Moses. Moses was a stubborn boy, and everyone in the village knew it. Karim, a small village in Nigeria, was peaceful and filled with simple, hard-working people. Moses, however, was different. He lived with his old grandmother after his parents had passed away. Life wasn't easy for them. They were poor, and the small hut they called home looked like it could fall down any day. Yet, the villagers were kind-hearted. They often brought food, clothes, and even money to help Moses and his grandmother. But despite the love and help from others, Moses was a handful. His stubbornness was legendary. At school, teachers dreaded the sight of him, and at home, his grandmother could hardly keep up with his mischief. At school, Moses had a habit of causing trouble in class. He had a close friend named John, and together they were the terror of the teachers. One day, as the class waited for their teacher to arrive, Moses turned to his friend John and said loudly, "Why are teachers always late, yet they punish us when we are late?" The teacher, Mrs. Alibi, entered just at that moment and froze. "Moses, what did you just say?" she asked sternly. "I asked why you are late," Moses repeated boldly as the whole class gasped. "Moses, sit down!" Mrs. Alibi shouted, her face turning red with anger. During break time, Moses didn't stop there. He marched to the teacher's chair at the front of the classroom, sat down with a book in hand, and started imitating Mrs. Alibi's voice. "Class, open your books to page 49. If you don't, I will write your names on the blackboard," he said, mimicking her tone perfectly. The other pupils burst into laughter, but some quickly ran to report him. When Mrs. Alibi returned and found Moses sitting in her chair, she was furious. "Moses, stand up!" she barked. Moses stood up, smiling cheekily. "I was just teaching the class, madam," he said innocently. "Moses, go and kneel outside," Mrs. Alibi said angrily, holding her cane. But even after being punished, Moses wouldn't apologize. "It's not my fault the chair looked lonely," he muttered, earning himself a few more strokes of the cane. One day, things got worse. Moses and Mrs. Alibi had an argument that would go down in history. The lesson was on spelling, and Mrs. Alibi wrote the word "one" on the blackboard. "Moses," she said, "read this word." Moses looked at it and said loudly, "It's one, but it should start with an O." Mrs. Alibi frowned. "It does start with an O, Moses." "No, madam. It should begin with the letter O, not just sound like it," Moses argued stubbornly. The whole class erupted in laughter. Some of the pupils shook their heads, wondering how Moses could be so bold. Mrs. Alibi could hardly believe her ears. "Moses, you are trying to challenge me?" Moses shrugged. "I'm just saying what I know, madam. Is it wrong to ask questions?" That was the last straw. Mrs. Alibi chased Moses out of the classroom. "Out! Go and stay outside!" she yelled. As Moses stood outside the classroom, he shouted loudly, "I was only trying to correct the teacher." "What's wrong with that?" The other students laughed as Mrs. Alibi stormed out, muttering to herself. The following day, Mrs. Alibi decided to take action. "Moses, you must bring your parent or guardian to school tomorrow. I need to talk to them about your behavior." Moses rolled his eyes and replied rudely, "Why, madam?" "Can't you handle me alone?" Mrs. Alibi's patience was running out. "No more questions, Moses. Bring your parent or don't come back to school." The next morning, Moses arrived with a man who no one recognized. "Madam," Moses said proudly, "here is my parent." "Talk to him." Mrs. Alibi looked at the man suspiciously. "Are you his father?" The man scratched his head nervously. Yes, I am his uncle." Mrs. Alibi sighed. "I asked for his parent, not his uncle." The man nodded, clearly confused. "Well, I'm here. What do you want to say?" Mrs. Alibi explained Moses's behavior, his rudeness, his stubbornness, and his constant disruptions in class. The man nodded again and said, "Moses, stop troubling the teacher. You hear me?" Moses grinned and replied, "I hear, Uncle. Thank you. Can I go back to class now?" Mrs. Alibi shook her head in disbelief. She knew this parent wasn't really a parent, but what could she do? The next day, Moses was back in class, as stubborn as ever. During another lesson, Moses asked yet another ridiculous question that left everyone in stitches. "Madam," Moses said, raising his hand, "if you were a bird, would you still be our teacher?" Mrs. Alibi stared at him. "Moses, what kind of question is that?" "I'm just asking," Moses said innocently. "If you were a bird, would you teach us or just fly away?" The class burst into laughter, and Mrs. Alibi felt like tearing her hair out. "Moses, just stop talking!" But Moses couldn't stop. Another day, during a math lesson, he stood up and asked, "Madam, why do we need to learn addition when calculators exist?" His friend John clapped his hands in support. "Yes, madam." "That's a good question." "Sit down, both of you," Mrs. Alibi shouted, feeling her patience slipping away. Despite all the punishment, Moses never seemed to change. His grandmother, too old to come to the school, didn't know half the trouble he caused. When she scolded him at home, Moses would shrug and say, "It's not my fault teachers don't have a sense of humor." In the village of Karim, Moses' reputation grew. Some laughed at his antics, while others shook their heads and prayed he would change someday. Mrs. Alibi, meanwhile, sat in the staff room, wondering how a boy like Moses could be so stubborn and yet so sharp with his words. "I hope one day this boy learns a lesson," she muttered. "Otherwise, he's going to give us all gray hair." And so, Moses continued to be the most stubborn boy in Karim, leaving both his teachers and his village wondering what they would do with him next. When Moses could come back home, he could go with friends to play near places where dead people were buried. For Moses, the graveyard was nothing more than an unusual playground. While most children in the village avoided it out of fear, Moses found it exciting. He would run, shout, and jump from one grave to another as if they were stepping stones in a river. Wake up, dead people. You are oversleeping," Moses would shout, laughing loudly as he stomped on the mounds of earth covering the graves. His friends, including John, stood at a distance, their eyes wide with fear. "Moses, stop that! You're going to make the spirits angry," John would warn, his voice shaking. But Moses was never one to listen. "Angry? Ha! What can they do to me? Dead people are like dead snakes. They can do nothing. You people are just cowards," he replied boldly, jumping higher on the graves. The other boys would exchange worried glances. "Let's go," one of them would whisper, but Moses wouldn't stop. "Nothing will happen. If you're scared, leave me alone," Moses would say, dismissing their warnings. Day after day, Moses continued his game, taunting the dead without a care in the world. To him, it was all harmless fun. But one day, everything changed. It was a hot afternoon, and the sun was high in the sky. Moses, as usual, dragged John and the other boys to the graveyard. "Let's go. Today I'll show you a new trick. I can jump on 3 graves without stopping," he bragged. "Moses, today I have a bad feeling." "Let's not go there," John said nervously. "Bad feeling," Moses mocked, laughing. "John, you have bad feelings about everything. Come and watch greatness." Reluctantly, the boys followed him. Moses picked the largest grave and began jumping. Wake up, you lazy dead! Even John wakes up faster than you," he shouted, his voice echoing across the quiet graveyard. Suddenly, a deep, chilling voice boomed from beneath the grave. "Who is that one? Jumping on me!" Moses froze mid-jump. His heart pounded, but he forced a laugh. "Nice try, John. That voice didn't scare me." John's face turned pale. "Moses, that wasn't me!" The other boys stared, trembling. "It's not us, Moses. Let's get out of here." Ignoring them, Moses stomped harder on the grave. I said wake up! He shouted defiantly. Then it happened. Something icy gripped Moses' ankles. At first, he thought it was a trick, maybe John pulling a prank. But the grip tightened, and he felt himself sinking into the earth. Let go of me! Moses screamed, trying to jump, but his legs felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds. Moses, what's happening? John shouted, panic in his voice. I can't move! Something's holding my legs! Moses cried out, tears welling in his eyes. The boys ran closer, but what they saw made their blood run cold. Moses' legs were halfway buried in the ground, as if the grave itself was swallowing him. Moses, stop playing games! Come out of there! John shouted, though he knew this was no game. I'm not playing! Help me! Moses wailed, thrashing his arms desperately. The boys screamed and ran back to the village, shouting, Moses is stuck in the grave! The spirits have caught him! Villagers came running with worried faces, shouting questions. Where is he? What happened? When they arrived at the graveyard, they found Moses still struggling. His face was pale with fear, and his legs refused to budge. The villagers gasped. We warned you, Moses, now you see! An old woman cried, pointing an accusing finger. Plead with the spirits, boy! Another man shouted. Talk to the dead! Tell them you're sorry! Someone else added. But Moses was too scared to speak. He cried out, I didn't mean it! Please, let me go! The villagers tried pulling him out, but it was as if an invisible force held him tight. The more they tried, the heavier Moses seemed. Some of the villagers even ran away in fear. This is beyond us, they said. We need the witch doctor. An elder quickly sent for the village witch doctor, a man named Baba Chuku. Baba Chuku arrived, wearing his long beaded robes and carrying a stick decorated with feathers. He looked at Moses and shook his head. Did I not tell you children not to disturb the dead? He said in a deep, stern voice. I was just playing, Baba. I didn't know, Moses cried, sobbing uncontrollably. Too late for excuses, Baba Chuku muttered, kneeling beside the grave. He began chanting words in a language no one understood, his voice rising and falling like a drum beat. He sprinkled strange powders over the grave and hit the ground 3 times with his stick. Guess what happened next? The earth beneath Moses' feet trembled. Suddenly, his legs were released, and he fell back onto the ground, gasping for air. The villagers cheered with relief, but Baba Chuku raised his hand. Silence! This boy must learn respect for the dead. Moses sat on the ground, shivering. He whispered, I'm sorry. I'll never do it again. John approached him cautiously. Moses, are you okay? Moses looked at him, his eyes wide with fear. I thought I was going to stay with the dead forever. Well, you're lucky you're not one of them now, John replied, shaking his head. Didn't I tell you this would happen? The villagers took Moses back home, and for the first time he sat quietly in his grandmother's hut, thinking about what had happened. That night, he couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the voice. Who is that one jumping on me? From that day on, Moses never set foot in the graveyard again. The villagers would often say, Moses has finally learned his lesson. And whenever someone mentioned the graveyard, Moses would shake his head and mutter, I don't joke with the dead anymore. But John, always the joker, would smile and say, Next time, Moses, maybe you'll challenge the spirits to a dance. And everyone would laugh. Everyone except Moses. After some few years, Moses still went with his friends to play near the grave, promising not to jump on the graves again. The boys were older now, but the graveyard still held a strange fascination for them. On this particular day, they chose a spot at a safe distance to play. They laughed, chased each other, and skipped stones, but every now and then, Moses' eyes wandered toward the graves. The memory of what had happened a few years ago, when something held his legs down, suddenly came back to him. He narrowed his eyes at the graves. How could those dead people punish me back then? Moses muttered to himself, frowning. They embarrassed me in front of everyone. John, standing nearby, noticed Moses' stare and asked, "Moses, what are you looking at?" "Nothing," Moses replied quickly, but an idea was already forming in his mind. "I am going to revenge," he said aloud, his voice low but determined. John's eyes widened. "Revenge? Moses, no! Didn't you learn your lesson last time? Leave the dead alone." The other boys nodded in agreement. "Yes, Moses, we are not going there again." But Moses wasn't listening. He slowly walked toward the graves, moving carefully so the others wouldn't follow. When he reached the largest grave, the very one that had swallowed his legs years ago, he squatted down and defecated right beside it. "Yes, it will smell badly for them," he said triumphantly, laughing to himself. He ran back to his friends, wiping his hands on his shorts. "Guess what? I've revenged on those dead people. Let's see if they can do anything to me now." The boys stared at him in disbelief. "Moses, you're crazy!" John shouted. "Do you want them to punish you again?" "Nothing will happen," Moses said confidently, brushing off their warnings. "They're just dead people. They can do nothing." The next day, Moses was back at it again. "I'm going to revenge properly this time," he declared as the group walked near the graveyard. John grabbed his arm. "Moses, you are taking this too far. Stop it!" But Moses shook him off. "You boys are cowards. Watch a real man in action." Ignoring their protests, Moses moved toward the grave again. This time he unzipped his shorts and poured urine on the grave. "Take this," he shouted. "Now let's see if you can stop me." As soon as he finished his last words, something strange began to happen. Moses tried to turn around, but he couldn't move. He suddenly felt a burning sensation in his legs, and the stream of urine didn't stop. "Moses, are you done yet?" John called from a distance, but Moses didn't reply. "Moses," Moses began to cry. "Help me, I can't stop urinating." The boys ran over and froze in shock. Moses was still standing over the grave, unzipped, and the urine flowed like a never-ending river. "What's happening to him?" one of the boys whispered, terrified. "Moses, stop joking!" John shouted, but Moses cried louder. "I'm not joking, I can't stop. Forgive me for only today." Moses wailed, tears streaming down his face. His legs felt heavy and his body felt weak, but still, the urination continued. The boys screamed and ran back to the village. "Moses is being punished again," they yelled. "Something bad is happening to him at the graveyard." Villagers rushed to the scene. When they arrived, they found Moses trembling, unable to move. The witch doctor, Baba Chuku, was called once more. He arrived with his beads and powders, shaking his head in disbelief. "This boy again?" Baba Chuku muttered. "Didn't you learn last time, Moses?" "I'm sorry, Baba," Moses sobbed. "Please help me." Baba Chuku began his chants again, striking his stick against the earth. He sprinkled powders and shouted words no one understood. Slowly, Moses felt the burning stop, and the flow of urine finally ceased. He collapsed onto the ground, exhausted and ashamed. The villagers gathered around him, shaking their heads. "Moses, how many times must you be warned? Respect the dead," one elder said sternly. Moses nodded weakly, his voice hoarse. "I will never come back here again, I promise." As the villagers helped Moses back home, Baba Chuku gave one final warning. "To all parents here, pray for your children. When children are stubborn, bad things can happen. Discipline them while they are young." From that day, Moses stayed far away from the graveyard. His friends teased him, saying, "Next time, Moses will try shaking hands with the spirits." But Moses never laughed. He had learned his lesson. Parents in the village began praying for their children, especially those with stubborn behavior, realizing that spiritual matters should not be ignored. For those reading this story, there is a clear lesson. Respect is important, even for those who are no longer with us. Parents must guide their children in the right way. As the Bible says in Proverbs 22:6, "Train up a child in the way he should go, and when